following presentation was recorded live by Voices from Jerusalem.
The destruction of the Second Temple. Important because A, it's one of the most important historical events in the Jewish people, certainly one of the most depressing, but I pay specific attention to this period of time. Remember, we're talking about, our past is our future, Jewish history, Jewish destiny. There's no period of time that more reflects what's going on in Israel today and the Jewish people today than that which was happening 2,000 years ago. Okay, as I said, we're still living in the consequences of the destruction of the Second Temple. Consequences certainly spiritually, but just in the reality of what the Jewish people are today. The same problems we had then are the same problems we have now. So it's extremely important to study this period of time carefully, because there's a lot of very valuable lessons that we could learn and pitfalls that need to be avoided. Okay, before we actually talk about the revolt, just to bring everyone up to speed again, what's going on in the larger historical picture. Remember, after the death of Herod the Great in 4 BCE, his empire, that's, again, a period, we talked about Herod last week, not a particularly great guy, but we're talking about a very effective proxy emissary for the Romans. There's a lot of, during his 33, 34 years of reign as king of Israel, it's a period of stability with no major problems. Okay, not a golden age for the Jewish people, but from then on it's going to be all downhill. When Herod dies, okay, his kingdom is divided up between his 3 sons, one of which I'm sure you all know. One is named Archelaus. Archelaus is actually the person who's made more or less the king. Okay, but there are other ethnarchs. His other sons are given specific geographic portions of the land of Israel to rule. One is Herod Philip. He builds. Anyone been up to Banyas? A beautiful place up north, one of the sources of the Jordan River. He builds the city there. It's also called Caesarea. No, they're all called Caesarea after Caesars. But the remains of the city we have today, if you go to Banya, it's a very interesting place, are built by Herod Philip mostly. And the third governor of also the Galilee, I believe he was, is the one that we're all familiar with in the New Testament story, Herod Antipas. Okay? That's the guy, that's the Herod in the New Testament story. So not to be confused with Herod the Great. He's not the king in the New Testament story. Okay, there are no kings. Now, Archelaus, unlike Herod, who, despite his brutal nature, was diplomatic and intelligent enough to keep things under control, Archelaus, it seems, was a very vicious, brutal person, and the Jews complained about him so much. And again, the Romans, always very practical people, as brutal as they were, practical, realized that if they leave this guy in power, it's going to cause a war in Israel, which would be bad news. So he's removed by the year 6 of the Common Era, and the Romans go back to direct rule of the Jewish people through the procurators. Okay, and remember the procurators, these were the local authority, almost always in the city of Caesarea, who were in charge of running the country. Okay, the only break we're going to have in that period of time, again, is during the reign of, as I mentioned before, Agrippa I, from 44 to 1 of the Common Era. He is the grandson of Herod the Great. He was raised as a hostage in Rome. When I say raised as a hostage, the Romans, being the practical people they were, always preferred to rule through proxies. And what they would do to make sure that the local ruler would stay in line is they would take their children as hostages. Now, hostage doesn't mean that Agrippa I was tied to a bed in a dark room and, kept blindfolded and fed by his captors. It means he's raised as a sort of a royal member of the household of Rome. And, of course, if daddy disobeys, he'd be put to death. But that's a separate problem. But otherwise, he's treated as one of the family, which actually works out very well because he grows up as friends of, if you read Suetonius, he grows up as friends of, like, Claudius. He knows Caligula. These are like his friends, like his schoolmates, which puts him in a unique position when he is in power for a few years, 3 years, to advocate. He, unlike his grandfather, seems to have been a very loyal Jew. Okay, both the Jewish sources and certainly Josephus describes him as someone very popular amongst the mainstream Jewish people, which of course means that he's going to be killed. Okay, and he's bumped off by he doesn't last too long. As anyone is in power, those people who don't like loyal Jews being in power, namely the Hellenized or the Tzaddukim, they're going to make sure that people like that don't stay in power too long. So Agrippa I is killed. The only other character in this family line we're going to hear about of any significance is a guy called Agrippa II, who is not king of Israel. He's nominally in charge of, again, a portion of the land of Israel. He's the guy who's going to be in charge in the land of Israel when the Great Revolt breaks out. He's not the king, though. He has ethnarch status, sort of quasi-royal, but not king status in the land of Israel. After that, we're not going to hear much about the Herodian line. They more or less disappear. But the whole period of time, from when Archelaus is deposed in 4 until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70, we're talking about direct Roman rule. And it's the Roman rule in the land of Israel, which is generally, as I mentioned before, very brutal. Most of these procurators, people like Pontius Pilate and Felix, Florus, again, I refer all of you to Josephus. He goes through this in tremendous detail, what all these guys are doing, all the little events that lead up to the outbreak of the revolt. These guys are very brutal. Okay, most of them openly side with the Gentile, Hellenized minority against the Jewish inhabitants of the land. And it's going to certainly be the match that is going to ignite the straw that's going to lead to this disastrous revolt. So on one hand, I'm giving you some background here, what's leading up to this terrible event. On one hand, we see that it's certainly the Roman rule, which was not very effective in the land of Israel, is going to play a big part in it. And I'm sure if the Roman government back in Rome had known, and certainly Josephus hints at this, had known how bad some of the procurators were, a guy like Felix, and according to Josephus, a guy like Florus, who's the last of the procurators, pretty much deliberately triggers the revolt to cover up for the mess he's made in the country. Because if peace is maintained and the Romans come and investigate and they find out what a bum he is, he's going to be deposed and end up getting executed, and he's in trouble. So better to lead to a massive revolt, and he can cover his tracks by slaughtering the Jewish people and making it seem like the Jews were deserving of his brutal punishment than getting his act together. So that certainly is one of the aspects that, at least if you look at Josephus, he definitely mentions it. The other side of the background to the conflict, which is extremely important from the Jewish perspective, is the internal conflict within the Jewish people. Okay, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about the different sects going on in the Jewish world. That's S-E-C-T-S. Okay, no one should misunderstand what I'm talking about here. Everyone's ears are perking up. Sectarianism is a big thing in Jewish history. Okay, today, and this is one of the great parallels between what's going on 2,000 years ago and today. We have the same problems, and you see it very clearly in the land of Israel more than other places. I always find it very amusing that people think that the Orthodox world is monolithic. There's no part of the Jewish community that is more divided than the religious. Nothing worse than a guy thinking God is on his side and he's right. And believe me, there's lots of... We see this everywhere in the Jewish world, but specifically in the land of Israel more intensely, because here you have the issues of religion and politics and nationalism all mixed together in a very volatile combination. One of the great patterns you see in the ancient Jewish world, as you see today, is that the diaspora Jewish community, which is certainly 2/3, if not more, of the Jewish population of the ancient world, is always going to be more laid back. There's just something about living in diaspora. When you're a minority, you just can't behave the way you can behave in the land of Israel amongst your family, right? You ever notice, you guys and your parents, you'll figure out very quickly that your kids, who can be little devils in the house, can be absolute angels. The teachers will send home notes about how righteous they are and what an example they are, and you're sure that the notes got switched somewhere. Like, this is not my kid. I mean, thank God they don't behave like animals outside the house. But this is a very interesting pattern for the Jewish people inside the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel. It's going to affect the politics and certainly be a major cause of the revolt. And when we get to talking about Christianity, we're also going to see it's going to be a major difference between how Jews are going to impact Gentiles outside the land of Israel versus inside. Meaning outside, we're going to see a lot of sort of more liberal, the word liberal is a dangerous word to throw around, but a more liberal attitude of the Jewish community, more tolerant, more laid back, less fanatic, just because you can't behave that way when you're living as a minority, even if you're albeit a very significant minority in someone else's country, versus the incredible intolerance and fractiousness and negative interaction with the Gentiles that we're going to see in the land of Israel. So this place is always like a little like nuclear furnace. The land of Israel is a very intense place. It's very interesting, and you see it now very clearly, just as you see it then. So we definitely have factions in the Jewish diaspora, for sure. And by the way, diaspora then is not 90% assimilated Jews. In the ancient world, we have definitely, I would say, a big percentage of Jews who are I would call them the modern Orthodox of the ancient world, meaning trying to synthesize the best of Hellenistic culture with loyalty to Torah and a loyalty to the land of Israel and to the temple and to all the institutions that make up normative Judaism. You do have that. But in the land of Israel, you got a lot more little factions going on. And we don't want to you could spend hours talking about the different sects. Again, Josephus goes into great detail to describe them. He is, as always, the source for all this information. But just to outline a little of what's going on in the land of Israel, because we have to understand that all conflicts in Jewish history that lead to disaster, there's always going to be an element of internal problem within the Jewish people. The Gentile might come from without and do the dirty work, but the problem is always going to be from within. And this is very, very clear in the Jewish sources. So what's going on in the land of Israel? You asked the question at the beginning about the different groups. In a nutshell, what do we have? We have, first of all, Jews and Gentiles. There's a lot of Gentiles living in the land of Israel. Pagans. Okay? Hellenized, Greco-Romans. I don't mean Italians who moved over from Italy. I mean people who were left from various, again, we're talking about a lot of people migrating through here. People from all over the ancient Near East settled in the land of Israel, Hellenized pagans and Jews. So there's a basic friction point, which is the same friction point we have during the Hanukkah story, which is paganism versus Judaism. That's going to be here. Okay? That's number one. Within the Jewish people, you have a number of groups. First of all, the biggies that we know from before, the Sadducees, the Tzadukim, and the Pharisees, the Perushim. Okay? The Tzadukim, remember, what are the Tzadukim? They're the descendants of this apostate student, Tzadok and Botus, right? They deny the validity of the oral law. They deny the rabbis the right to interpret and apply that law. They basically dumped the whole oral tradition out. They denied life after death. They're primarily associated with the upper classes and often with the priestly classes. Many of the high priests are Tzadukim. They often have the backing of the Roman authorities. They often will be siding with the Gentiles. They're not secular Jews, however. A Tzaduki today, if you saw a Tzaduki, you'd think he was a really religious guy. They're not like, I just give up on Torah, okay? And you have the mainstream organization group in the Jewish world is the Pharisees. Okay, remember these are, as we mentioned, all different groups. The Tanoim, the rabbis talk about in the Mishnah and later in the Talmud. Mainstream, and their basic thing is very middle of the road. They have seems to be, according to Josephus, certainly he says this, and according to traditional Jewish sources, the vast majority of the Jewish people in the land of Israel are backing these people. These are the people who are going to outlast everyone else, more or less, and go on to ensure the survival of the Jewish people. These are all the great rabbis we read about. Okay, so those are two big groups in the Jewish people. Then you have a bunch of other smaller splinter sects. You have a bunch of guys called the Kanoim. You know what a Kanoi is? Yeah. Kanoim Pogimbo? A Kanoi is a zealot or a fanatic. Now, these are guys who are more or less aligned with the Pharisees, but are much more extreme. First of all, they tend to be very nationalistically inclined. They're outraged by the fact that the uncircumcised pagan Romans are sitting in the Holy Land, right? How dare they, right? The modern equivalent of these guys. Now, we have modern equivalents to all of these people in the world today. The Tzaddukim we don't have. We have the Pharisees. That's like the mainstream religious world, I would say the Haredi world, more or less, okay, as a parallel, not exact. The Kanoim are definitely the religious right in Israel, very close parallel to the ideology. The idea of, again, there's definitely differences, not exact, but the idea of the land of the Gush Emunim movement that appears after the 67 war, that the Jewish people should control, I see you're smiling there, the entire land of Israel. An interesting conversation about this after class with someone. That's very much the ideology to an extent. We're talking about people who are very religious, very serious about Torah and God, but also very serious about the nationalistic aspects of Judaism and the Holy Land should be entirely in the hands of the Jewish people, the Kanoim. And amongst the Kanoim, sorry? Mizrahi, I don't know if I'd use the word Mizrahi so much, but B'nai Akiva is closer. I mean, Mizrahi is a bit of Mizrahi is like, it's definitely sort of that ideology, but I would call it more a segment of the religious right, which is the Gush Emunim community, which is generally a little more religiously observant, more fanatical in observance. Often as fanatically observant, the word fanatical is a bad word, but as serious about it as the Haredi community. I don't want to get into modern politics in Israel. Mizrahi community is a huge community. It's not. I wouldn't want to say they're all in that camp. The people the names that are associated, if you read Josephus, it's Eliezer ben Shimon, Yochanan Gush Chalav, Gishhala. Gush Chalav is up north in the land of Israel. Those are some of the major characters. If you read Josephus, their names will come out. The other groups you have they're really not nice guys. We're not talking about the Gentile, anti-Semites. We're talking about two groups called the Sikari and the Biryonim. And these guys are just like criminal elements, often masquerading under the guise of religious nationalism or just nationalism, but generally they're outlaws. Okay, you have, and the names associated with those, you have Menachem and Eliezer ben Yair. Eliezer ben Yair being one of the people the guy who's going to lead the resistance at Masada, and Shimon bar Giora, Those guys, they'll come up again. If you read Josephus, these names will appear. Again, these are guys who they're called Zakai, means dagger. They would like assassinate their opponents. These are kind of like, like the Islamic thought police. I don't know what they are. They're not even religious. They're really not religious. They're just criminals. They're just basically criminals, more or less. That's the from what the sources seem to indicate about these guys. Masada, we get to talk about Masada, who's up there and who's not up there. It seems to be that some of them are just zealots. And the problem is we're limited in our sources. We're looking at Josephus. Josephus has a specific perspective. Not too much is said about these. We do have in the Talmud that these names do come up. Some of them are mentioned. The Jewish sources mention that there are 24 Kaf Dalet Kitot Beretz Israel, 24 different groups, in the land of Israel. Okay, so 24 is not an exact number, but there are certainly lots of groups. So then you have the last group I want to talk about is very significant. They don't exist anymore at all. But these are like the real extreme religious separatist fanatics. Most important among them are a group of people called the Essenes. Okay, or the Dead Sea sect. Can be used interchangeably. We don't know exactly who. If you guys are familiar with what is one of the most significant textual discoveries in the modern Jewish world, which was discovered right on the eve of the War of Independence, 1948, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of that refers to documents found in a place called Qumran on the northeast corner of the Dead Sea. It was a settlement. As to what it was originally is one of the most hotly debated topics in modern Israeli archaeology. But the majority of archaeologists believe that a group of people that Josephus describes as the Essenes, Dead Sea sect, lived there. Who are the Essenes? We definitely see at this period of time, this is going to be very relevant. The next class we do is going to be on Christianity. Very interesting topic. Tomorrow, hopefully, we'll get to it. We're going to see that the Essenes are part and parcel of a whole sort of worldview that's going to be very popular at this period of time, which is kind of the guys walking around with the billboards, the end is near, repent you sinners. The Essenes were a break-off group of Jews who basically believed that the high priesthood was corrupted by the Tzaddukim, that even the rabbis didn't have their act together, and that the end is near, and we got to prepare ourselves. And what would they do? They separated themselves, and they go live in places that are not, like the desert, down by the Dead Sea, far away from the corruption of the city and the temple and all that's going on there. And they were obsessive in ritual purity. They would go to some people say they were celibate. A lot of Christians are into the Dead Sea sect because they believe that the model for monastic life almost certainly comes from them. We're going to see monasteries, which will appear hundreds of years later, are almost certainly based on this idea of these scenes, separation from the temptation of the physical world, even celibacy possible. We're not sure who's celibate, whether they weren't or not. They had their own body of Jewish work. All the oldest versions of biblical texts we have come from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they also created their own corpus of writings. They have their whole set of laws for becoming a member of this so-called kibbutz movement here. They had a whole book, a lot of apocalyptic writings, the wars of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. It would be great stuff to read. The millennium. It's stuff the Christian world is really into. If you look in the book of Revelations, you can see they definitely are inspired by a lot of this stuff. So these were like extreme religious separatists to break away from mainstream Judaism. Okay, they're not denying the validity of Torah, but they add on a lot of their own stringencies, create their own documents and their own movement. They too are going to cease to exist after the Great Revolt. Okay, a lot of these groups are going to be gone after the revolt. They're going to have no reason to exist anymore, or they're going to be physically destroyed. Okay, pretty much all we're going to have left after the revolt we're going to see are the rabbis and the Gentiles. Okay, and the mainstream Judaism. But everything else is going to fade by the wayside. Yes, sir?
Sorry, what exactly is contained in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
I'm sorry, what's your name? Paul. What's contained in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Again, that's a big topic. It contains a large amount of material from Jewish sources, from the 24 books of the Jewish Bible. It contains specific writing. Some of it, by the way, is not related to the Essenes at all. Letters from Bar Kokhba during his revolt, from Nachal Cheva are in there. It contains a lot of additional writings that are invented by the Dead Sea sect. Okay.
I'm not sure how true this is, but the reason why they haven't been published or publicised that much is they seem to disprove Christianity.
Okay, that's a good. Paul's asking an interesting question. The reason why the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, discovered in the late 40s, were for the vast majority not published until recently. Herschel Shanks, of Biblical Archaeology Review, led the campaign to free up the translation process to get it out quickly. There was speculation that the church had control of pretty much in the Rockefeller Museum. The church had more or less, since the beginning, control of the translation of the Dead Sea sects, and the idea was that they reveal embarrassing things about the origins of Christianity and are being suppressed. As far as I know, now in the last decade, a vast majority of material is out, and there's nothing there that is particularly embarrassing to Christianity at all. So that's just a nice theory that I don't believe has any basis in reality. Nah, I don't know what. I don't think so. I think that's just one of those like conspiracy theory things that doesn't hold any water, in my opinion. Herschel Shanks has an excellent book out, by the way, if you want to read it, called The Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a great introduction to it. It's a very significant, the most significant find of documents in the history of the Jewish people for sure. Okay, let's get to the revolt itself. That's what I want to spend the rest of the class talking about. And I do want to finish it today so we could pick up with Christianity tomorrow. Okay. Again, there's a lot of detail as to what is leading up to the revolt. Again, I refer you to Josephus for details. We don't have time to go through what's going on. But basically, we throw all of this that I've talked about now into one big pot. The Jewish-Gentile problems, paganism versus Judaism, together with the internal problems in the Jewish people, the nationalism, the factionalism, and you name it. And it's going to explode into what is one of the more significant revolts in the Roman Empire, beginning in around the year 66 of the Common. The event that, now again, who's in charge in Israel? The procurator. Who's the procurator? He's a guy by the name of Florus. He is not a nice guy. Josephus paints him to be particularly brutal, selfish, and a man, again, who more or less deliberately pushes the Jews to the extreme to cover up for his own. It's like, it's like a guy who's has a lot of incriminating records, in his files about his money laundering activities and his bribes. So what does he do? He burns a whole apartment complex down to an arson job to try and cover up his tracks. That's sort of the view given by the traditional sources. The event that triggers the revolt, again, it's a build-up. If you become a student of history, you realize it's very rare in human history that one event triggers something. Like if you look at the start of World War I, the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand is always given as the event that triggers World War I. But any serious student of history knows that the World War I was a combination of a long series of events, and this was merely, we're talking about kicking a toothpick out underneath a weight and it falls over. We're talking about the things that led up to it are much more complicated, and you have to look much further back in history to see what's going on. So too with this period of time. It's not one event. But certainly we say that Florus basically pushes the Jews to the extreme. The Jews, by the way, are desperately, especially with the rabbis, the Pharisees, are always trying to avoid conflict because the extreme right, the Kanoim, are pushing. Let's push the Romans into a civil, war so you can go kill them all and declare independence. The basic stand of the majority of the Jews, and this seems to be borne out also by Josephus, is they're trying to stay out of trouble. Rebelling against Rome is not a simple thing. We're talking about the greatest military machine in human history. Again, I mentioned the Roman, these are the guys who perfected the art of professional warfare and siege, unstoppable virtually in human history, and incredibly brutal. Okay, we're not talking about like the U.S. Army coming in and the Israelis fighting and save the women and children. We're talking about the Roman policy was generally live and let live. Okay, you follow Roman law. They were very tolerant to people who basically behaved themselves. But if you stepped out of line at all, the Roman policy was brutal, unlike almost any people in human history. And obviously the rabbis of the day were aware of that. If you mess with Rome and you get in their face and you step on their feet, the consequences are going to be incredibly brutal. It's not going to be the Romans going to come with a few soldiers and arrest the instigators. The Romans are going to trash the whole country. So their policy was to avoid confrontation. Florus pushes and pushes and pushes. The internal combination of all of the factions in the Jewish people, combined with the external pressure, and you name it, explodes. Okay, explodes. The event that triggers it, we say, is Florus, who was in Caesarea. He leaves the city for a little while. The pagans rise up. Now, Caesarea, again, being the most pagan of all places in the land of Israel. They slaughter the Jewish community. We're talking about killing thousands of Jews. And that's the event that touches, that lights the hay, that ignites the bonfire, that consumes the whole country in this great revolt. Now, I want to read you, by the way, this is from Gittin, 65a through b. This is the rabbinic account of what starts the revolt. Now, this is not necessarily meant to be taken as history here, but there's a very important lesson in here. It's a story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. People heard about this? It's a story about a guy who's having a feast, and he wants to invite his friend Kamsa, and by accident his enemy Bar Kamsa gets invited, and he comes to the feast, and the guy sees him at his feast, says, "What are you doing here?" He wants to throw him out. And Bar Kamsa says, don't embarrass me in public, I'll tell you what, let me just stay for a few minutes. And Ali goes, get out. He goes, I'll tell you what, I'll pay for my meal, let me stay. And he says, I'll pay for the whole banquet, just don't embarrass me. The guy takes him and throws him out the door. And Bar Kamsa, who's humiliated, goes and sicks the Romans on the Jews. Now, this may or may not be a true historical event. It's not even important. The point is the lesson behind is we're talking about hatred of one Jew for another is what really leads to the revolt. We have to keep that in mind. The real cause from the Jewish perspective, and the lesson we need to learn, is not don't mess with Rome because they're not around anymore. We don't have to worry about Rome. We have other offshoots of them we may have to worry about, but the real message here is the dangers of factionalism and hatred amongst the Jewish people. I just want to read a little bit of this account. This is after Bar Kamsa has been thrown out. He's going to get back at not just his host, but he's going to make the whole Jewish people pay. Okay? He says, Bar Kamsa went to Caesar and said, the Jews have rebelled against you. Caesar said to him, how can I tell? Bar Kamsa said to him, send a sacrifice to them and see whether they offer it. Caesar sent a young calf with Bar Kamsa. A little background, by the way, the Jews were exempt from state religious practices of the Roman Empire because they were pagan. And to compensate, they would offer sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem on behalf of the emperor, which was their way through our religion of, in a kosher way, paying homage to the Roman Empire. Okay. Caesar sent a young calf to Bar Kamsa. While on the way, Bar Kamsa made a blemish on the upper lip, or as some say, on the white of its eye, a place which is considered a blemish to Jews but not to Romans. A teeny, very strict laws about offering sacrifice to be perfect. The rabbis considered sacrificing it for political peace, but Rabbi Zakai ben Abkula said, they will say that blemished animals may be slaughtered on the altar. So the rabbi said, look, guys, let's be lenient here because if we don't, this is going to cause us, the Romans are going to kill us. And this guy, he was very strict. He said, no, we can't do this. They considered killing Bar Kamsa so that he would not go and inform. But Rabbi Zakai said to them, same guy, they will say that one who blemishes a consecrated animal shall be killed. Rabbi Yochanan said, the discretion of Rabbi Zakai ben Abkulas destroyed our house and burned our temple and exiled us from our land. He sent Vespasian Caesar against them. He came and besieged Jerusalem for 3 years. By the way, the actual siege of Jerusalem was not 3 years. The whole war was 3 years. There were 3 rich men there. These men had enough to feed Jerusalem for 21 years. Very interesting. They stockpiled all the food. There was among them those rebels. The rabbi said to them, let us go out and make peace with them, the Romans. And the rebels would not allow them. Right? These are the extremists. And the zealots and the Biryonim, they're all like, no, let's fight. The rebels said to the rabbis, let us go out and make war against them. The rabbi said to them, it will not succeed. For lack of divine support is put in parentheses here that's the idea of the Talmud. They, the rebels, arose and burned the provisions of wheat and barley, and there was a famine. Very interesting what's going on here. Again, what's the Jewish perspective? The actual war is it's talked about in a very few sentences. I will mention the end of the story about Yochanan ben Zakai going out and trying to save the Jewish people. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the point is, the real problem is here. Look what's going on. You have intolerance in the Jewish world. You have a certain rabbi, right, who's being too strict, okay, and it causes disaster. You got to be careful, Sometimes it's time to be lenient here, okay? And you have a part of the population that just is not going to follow the rabbis and wants to pick a fight with the Romans, and that's what happens. So the Jewish people rebelled. It is not a unified rebellion at all. Not even close. Okay, not even close. You have different factions. There is some semblance of unified command. The Roman garrison is thrown out of Jerusalem, Agrippa II flees. Okay? The Romans do not have sufficient men stationed in the land of Israel to crush the revolt immediately. They have to call in their legions from the borders. Since they didn't station legions, after this time Roman legions will be stationed permanently in Israel because it's a hot spot. But the closest Roman legions are in Syria. Nero, who is the emperor, sends his best general, Vespasian. Okay, Vespasian comes from Europe. He meets up with his son Titus, who is stationed in Syria. We're talking about something like 4 Roman legions participate in the siege. Most famous is going to be the 10th Roman Legion, Fretensis, of course, with the pig's head as their symbol. Nothing more appropriate than that. The boar. And that's we're talking about 4 Roman legions. Again, something like each legion, 6,000 men. With auxiliaries, 12,000 men. Something like about 45 to 50,000 Roman soldiers. That's a lot of men for the Romans with auxiliaries. The Jews, again, we're not talking about a well-trained fighting force. The Jews did not have an army when the Romans occupied them. The Jews organized defense. Josephus, our friend, our historian friend, is put in charge of, according to his own account that is, of defending the Galilee. Now, lots of cities in the land of Israel did not go along with the revolt. The Galilee, by the way, always in Jewish history, is like a hotbed of religious fanaticism. It is. It's really. There's going to be some communities, a lot of Gentiles living up there also, but there are certain communities that were noticed in the time of Herod, when the city, I told you about this, the siege of the Arabel, when Herod is governor of the Galilee, when he has to lower the Roman soldiers down in the baskets. We talked about that, right? And the Jews committing suicide. It's always a place with a lot of very intensely fanatical Jews who are willing to die for the land of Israel, right? It's not like today we have them out in the West Bank. Then it was the Galilee. Okay? So the Romans work their way down systematically through the land of Israel, starting in the north, since they're coming from Syria with all their legions. Any city, a lot of cities just opened their gates and said, "Oh, Romans, we're not going to fight," and the Romans would spare them. Any city that put up the slightest resistance, it didn't matter how long they held out, they surrendered the next day, they were basically slaughtered. When the Romans punished, they punished incredibly brutally. Meaning they had breached the walls, and they were master siege people. They had all kinds of great equipment that you couldn't stand up against. They'd breach the walls of the city, pour into the city, slaughter most of the population, rape, pillage, take thousands of prisoners to be marched back to Rome, sold as slaves, or publicly executed and used for entertainment in these games. Destroy all the buildings, cut down all the trees, put salt in the ground so nothing would grow. We're talking about Syria. You mess with us, we mess with you. Josephus, by the way, who's at a place called Yotzfat, which is a fortified town up in the Galilee. The city is surrounded by the Romans. When they realize it's hopeless, they decide to commit suicide. One of the many realization at the time, the Romans are not going to spare us. Better to die at our own hands and not give the Romans the pleasures of selling us as slaves, feeding us to animals, or slaughtering us, or watching our wives and children be killed before our eyes. We'll commit suicide. We'll kill our families and die. It's a great story. Josephus talks about how, they do, at the end, the last couple of guys left, he's one of them. He convinces them to surrender to the Romans, not to commit suicide, and they do. This is his moment of treachery, so to speak. And he's adopted by the Romans, and he goes around the rest of the time watching. Now, he's going to write, when he goes back to Rome to write his life story, this is his eyewitness account of what's going on. The Romans work their way down to Jerusalem. They surround the city. The siege of Jerusalem is only a few months. It's not years. Okay, the whole war is about 3 years long, excluding Masada, which is another 3 years, and Michvar and Herodium, which lasts longer. A couple of isolated outposts. But when Jerusalem falls, it's a little more than 3 years. The Romans besiege the city, knowing if they can destroy Jerusalem, they'll destroy the Jewish people, destroy the will of the Jewish people. It's their spiritual center. Now, a huge number of people had fled to the city. The city of Jerusalem, I've asked many archaeologists what the population of the city was in normal times. It was a very big city. It probably had 100 to 150,000 inhabitants, which is a big city in the ancient world. The population could have swelled to 2 or 3 times that much. The city was also massively fortified. Remember, Herod embarked on a major campaign to build these amazing walls around the city, which weren't even finished by the time the Romans came. They were all like the Kotel walls, the Western Wall. Big blocks of stone, very hard to get out of place. So what do we have? A large number of Jews, and as we say, the richest men of the city had stockpiled a huge amount of food. We had a good water supply. Jews are fanatical fighters, by the way, not like kind of the image of wimpy Jews we have today. We're talking about Jews in the ancient world were like Japanese in the Pacific in World War II. They were crazy. Crazy. They would fight to the death. Fanatical. Even the Romans pay tribute to the valor of the Jews. As much as they hate them, you'll see all the Roman historians who discuss Jews in combat. You didn't want to fight these guys. So it seems like the Romans were in a very bad situation. They're trying to besiege one of the largest cities in the world, which is remarkably well fortified, which has a huge amount of food and water, and a lot of crazy people who are not afraid to die. Could have been that Jerusalem would have been the first city in the history of the Roman Empire the Romans wouldn't have taken by siege. But as we saw in this account in Gittin in the Talmud, the Jews did all the work for them, because as the Romans are outside the city trying to destroy the city, the Jews are inside the city doing what? Fighting a civil war. Yochanan Gush Chalav, Shimon Bar Giora, all these, the Zakai and the Biryonim and the Kanayim, they're all occupying different parts of the city. There's one group on the Temple Mount, one group in the lower city. They're killing each other. There's a siege going on in the city, trying to get onto the Temple Mount, which is a heavily fortified area. Sounds insane. To the point where the Talmud says they burned the food supply in the city so the people shouldn't get complacent and say, we'll outlast the Romans. We want to fight. If the people are starving, they'll have to break through the Roman siege and go look for food and fight the Romans. Sounds pretty insane, right? How could you be fighting a civil war at the time your enemy's trying to get in and slaughter you? And this is not a kinder, gentler Roman Empire here. We look at this, and you don't have to be a great historian to see, look what goes on in the Jewish world today. Go to the Knesset when people are actually there, which is almost never. There's almost never anyone in there except when it's a budget debate or a no confidence vote. Go to the Knesset and watch the left and the right in this country, religious and secular, literally having to be forcibly separated. Calling names like you wouldn't call... First graders don't call their names like this in class to each other, they're fighting outside, Calling each other names, insulting their mothers, it's unbelievable. Over what issue? Over how to deal with our enemy, the Arabs. First and foremost, by the way. This is the exact same insanity. The fractiousness, the causeless hatred. So the situation goes from what could have been a protracted siege to it declines very rapidly because the people are starving to death. Anyone caught trying to escape and forage for food is executed by the Romans. The Romans crucified you. The common punishment for rebellion is crucifixion, which is a horrible way to die. Anyone want information? I had a class or two from Joe Zayas, who's the world expert on crucifixion. It's not a nice way to die. They hang you up there and you die of hypovolemic shock because you can't get oxygen and blood to your brain. Whether they nailed you or not is not relevant. But anyone wants more information, there's a couple websites on it. It's pretty gruesome stuff. But the Romans crucified Jesus is hardly the only person to be crucified. In the first century, during the great slave revolt, Spartacus, remember the story, Kirk Douglas, the movie? After the revolt, the Romans crucified 6,000 people on the Appian Way. 6,000 people on the Appian Way, the major highway in Rome. The Romans were crucifying 300 to 500 people a day outside Jerusalem, all around the walls of the city. Anyone caught anywhere, crucified. They chopped down all the trees to make siege. It must have been a disgusting scene. All the land denuded of trees to make siege works. Okay? And what they did for siege works, they hung people on. We're talking about thousands of people surrounding the city crucified. 15, 20, 30, 40, who knows how many people they crucified at the end of the revolt. Terrible way. Obviously designed to psych out the defenders when you see Daddy sitting there dying slowly, hanging off some cross somewhere. Now, at the end of all this, what's going on? I want to relate, as we get to the end of the story, a very interesting story about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai. He's the leader of the Pharisaic community in Jerusalem. These are the guys who are trying to keep out of the struggle. They realize it's too late. The zealots, by the way, wouldn't let anyone leave the city. Even dead bodies, they'd run swords through to make sure you're really dead and not trying to surrender to the Romans. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai realizes that if Jerusalem falls and we're all slaughtered in the city, that's it for the Jewish people. Okay? Because all these big rabbis are trapped in there. We got to do something. He has himself... He has a false rumor spread that he's dead. He remarkably manages to make it outside the walls of the city without having a sword stuck through him by one of the zealots. And he's brought before Vespasian. I want to read in Gittin the description what they say here. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai arrived at the Roman camp, he said, peace unto you, king. Vespasian said to him, you are twice guilty of capital crime. Once because I am not king, and you called me king, and further because if I am king, why did you not come to me until now? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai said to Vespasian, that which you have said, I am not king, certainly you are king. If you were not king, Jerusalem would not have been given into your hands. For it is written, and Lebanon by the mighty one will fall. Meaning God would not give Jerusalem into the hands of anyone but a great ruler. Meanwhile, I'm just skipping a little here. Meanwhile, a messenger came to him, Vespasian from Rome. He said to him, rise because Caesar has died and the prominent men of Rome have decided to seat you as their head. They've made you Caesar. By the way, the reality is that there's a series of... He stops his campaign at this point historically because there's a fight for power, and he does emerge as Caesar after this, and he transfers the siege over to his son Titus. Okay, but meanwhile, what to finish the story? Vespasian said to him, Yochanan ben Zakai, and now that you are so smart, why did you not come to me until now? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai said to him, did I not tell you? Vespasian said to him, I also answered you. Vespasian said, I will go and send someone to take my place, but ask something of me that I may grant to you. So he says, for giving me this nice bracha of telling me I'm going to be king, and now it looks like I am going to be Caesar, I'll grant you like a wish. And what goes on here? He says... I just want to find a part where... Here he says, okay. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai said to him, give me Yavna and its sages, the chain of Rabbi Gamliel, okay, and doctors to cure Rabbi Tzadok. Rabbi Tzadok was this big righteous rabbi, had been fasting for the destruction of Jerusalem for many years. They figured he'd need his righteousness. Also, he wants the rabbis to be spared and to reestablish a place where the Sanhedrin can be reconvened in Yavna. We'll talk about the Sanhedrin moving around later. Very important. And that the family of the Nasi, the descendants of King David, the president of the Sanhedrin, Rabbi Gamliel's family, be spared. So Rabbi Joseph, and some say Rabbi Akiva, applied the verse to him. He sent sages backward and confuses their minds. This is Isaiah 44:25. He should have asked that Jerusalem be left alone this once. They're asking a question. The Talmud is asking an obvious question. Why didn't he ask to save Jerusalem? But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai must have thought, lest all this not be granted and there may not even be a small chance of salvation. Meaning the Romans will not allow us to have Jerusalem. They got the bloodlust in them. They're going to destroy the city. But we got to have Judaism spared. If the rabbis survive and the family of the house of King David survives and the line of the Nasi survives, then the Jewish people will carry on, because we can always survive physical destruction. There's the spiritual destruction is the big danger to us. And we see in hindsight it was one of the great moments of foresight in Jewish history. Because the Romans grant that wish, and the sages are allowed to survive, the Sanhedrin will survive, the chain of transmission will survive, and the Jewish people will survive. Vespasian leaves. Titus finishes the siege. He breaches the walls of the city. Okay, he pours into the city. Again, see Josephus for a dramatic description of the slaughter that takes place. Okay, and it's house-to-house fighting. The Jews fight to the death. He works his way onto the Temple Mount, and the temple's lit on fire and burned. What day is the temple destroyed on? Right, the 9th of Av of the year 70, according to Christian chronology dates. The Jewish chronology dates are 2 years up, but they say 68 still. There's a 2-year difference here. Sorry? Common era. Right. The same date as the first temple is destroyed. I want to read you Josephus' account here. And now since Caesar was, this is his account of what's happening, and now since Caesar was in no way able to restrain the enthusiasm and the fear of the soldiers, and the fire proceeded on more and more, he went into the holy place of the temple with his commanders and saw with it what it contained, which he found to be far superior to what the reporters and foreigners contained, and not inferior to what we ourselves boasted and believed about it. But as the flames had not as yet reached the interior, but was still consuming the rooms that were around the house, the holy house, and Titus supposed that the house itself might still be saved, he came in haste and endeavored to persuade the soldiers to quench the fire, and gave orders to Liberalius, the centurion of his bodyguard of spearmen, to beat the soldiers. Disobeyed orders with staves and to restrain them. This is, of course, Josephus trying to make Titus look like a nice guy who didn't want to destroy the temple. Okay? Yet their passions were too strong for the regard they had for Caesar and the dread that they had of him, who forbade them, as was their hatred of the Jews, and a certain vehement inclination to fight them, which was too strong for them also. Moreover, the hope of plunder induced many to go on, who thought that all the places within were full of money, seeing that all around it was made of gold. Besides, when Caesar ran out so hastily to restrain the soldiers, one of those who went into the place threw the fire upon the hinges of the gates in the dark. Then the flames burst out immediately from within the holy house itself, and when the commanders withdrew, Caesar with them, nobody any longer forbade those who were outside to set fire to it. Thus the holy house burned down with Caesar's approval. Okay, so basically he's making it seem like, he tried to stop okay, I'm sure it's not true. This is a great example of Josephus putting on his hat as official member of the royal family of Rome. Of course, if you look at the Jewish sources, it's very clear and very straightforward. The sources brought down in the Talmud, where it talked about in Tainus, is why was the second temple destroyed? Because of causeless hatred of one Jew for the next. Very important to focus on that. The Jewish, from an external source, we say, right, there's always two levels in history. There's what's going on in the physical realities of the world, but the real reason we have to see is the sinat chinam. The causeless hatred of one Jew for another Jew led to the destruction of the second temple, which is never going to be rebuilt again, and we still sit within that destruction. Okay, we're going to stop here. Tomorrow I want to pick up, I'll talk about the end of the Great Revolt, the fall of Masada, and then I want to talk about the consequences of the revolt and get into Christianity, which is a very, very significant topic. Okay, guys, have a great day.
This program is part of a series. For the continuation, please insert the next disc.